Kwame's lips met his, soft but insistent, tasting of firelight and something sweet, something Bakari couldn't name. Bakari sighed into the kiss, his fingers tangling in Kwame's hair, pulling him closer. The air cracked open with the deafening roar of a gunshot. Bakari's body jolted from the sound, his breath freezing in his chest. The darkened room, lit only by the flickering glow of a failing emergency light, held its breath along with him. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, chaos. One of Omar's men let out a guttural cry, stumbling backward, clutching his arm as dark red bloomed through his sleeve. He wasn't dead, but he had been shot. Bakari's eyes darted wildly, his pulse thundering. He hadn't seen it happen, hadn't seen who pulled the trigger, but then his gaze landed on Kwame, and everything made sense. The gun was in Kwame's hand. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the barrel, the scent of burned gunpowder sharp in the air. Kwame's stance was rigid, his arms still extended, his fingers locked around the grip. His breathing was uneven, his jaw tight, but his eyes, those deep, shadowed eyes, weren't wild with panic. No, they were calculating. He had taken his shot with purpose. Bakari's stomach twisted. Kwame had tried to make a move, but it had failed. The injured man gritted his teeth through the pain, his gun still clutched in his free hand. The others in the room reacted in a blink, too fast. Before Kwame could fire again, 3 guns were trained on him. Then, Omar moved. The leader's face was unreadable as he stepped forward, his sharp gaze locked onto Kwame. Slowly, methodically, he reached out and plucked the gun from Kwame's grip. Kwame didn't fight him. He didn't flinch. He just let Omar take it, his fingers uncurling from the metal like it no longer belonged to him. Bakari saw it then, saw what Kwame must have realized in that split second. There was no escape, not like this. Omar exhaled through his nose, weighing the gun in his palm, his eyes flicking toward his injured man. Then he turned back to Kwame, his expression as calm as ever. But there was a shift in the air. Something deeper, something worse. He smiled, and then he struck. The blow came so fast Bakari barely registered it. Omar's fist slammed into Kwame's stomach, knocking the breath from his lungs. Kwame doubled over with a sharp grunt, his knees nearly giving out, but 2 men grabbed his arms before he could collapse. Bakari's whole body went rigid. No! The second hit came even harder, across the face. Kwame's head snapped to the side, his lips splitting open, blood trickling down his chin. But still, he didn't make a sound, didn't give Omar the satisfaction of a reaction. But Bakari felt it, rage clawing its way up his throat. He wanted to shout, to fight, to do anything, but he couldn't. His wrists were still bound, his body still weak from exhaustion. The weight of the situation settled like a noose around Bakari's throat. Kwame had made his move, but it failed. Now there would be consequences. Omar let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he wiped his hand against his suit, as if Kwame's blood had tainted it. His gaze dropped to the gun in his hand before he casually tossed it aside. "Tie him up," he ordered. No hesitation. The men holding Kwame didn't waste time. Thick zip ties were wrenched around his wrists, yanked painfully tight. Too tight. There was no anger in Kwame's gaze, no regret, only acceptance. Bakari clenched his fists. What the hell was Kwame thinking? Did he really believe this was his fate, that he had no other way out? Omar crouched in front of Kwame, his voice as smooth as silk. "Tell me, was that a death wish, or do you still have some fight left in you?" Kwame didn't answer. He didn't need to. Bakari barely had time to register it before he was yanked to his feet. Kwame was dragged up beside him. Their bodies were shoved forward, stumbling toward the warehouse doors. A van waited just outside. The cold air hit Bakari like a slap, clearing the fog in his mind, but it didn't stop the fear twisting in his gut. He didn't know where they were being taken, didn't know what Omar planned to do. But he knew one thing. This wasn't the end. Not yet. They were still alive. And if they were still alive, there was still a way out. But first, he had to figure out exactly how deep Kwame's connection to Omar ran. Because after that failed escape attempt, there wouldn't be another chance. The van smelled of gasoline and old leather. The air inside was thick, suffocating, pressing in on Bakari like a vice. His hands were bound behind his back, the rough texture of the zip ties biting into his skin. Beside him, Kwame sat rigid, silent, his face unreadable beneath the bruises forming along his cheekbone. The engine growled to life, and the van jerked forward, the movement rough and unsteady. Bakari's shoulder slammed against Kwame's, but neither of them reacted. There was too much at stake to show weakness. The men in the front spoke in hushed tones, their voices blending with the hum of the vehicle. The one closest to them, a stocky man with a scar cutting across his jaw, kept his gaze fixed on them. Outside, the world blurred past, a city Bakari no longer recognized. They had driven through too many alleys, turned too many corners. If they were being taken to a second location, that meant one thing. They weren't supposed to be found. Bakari forced himself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help him now. He turned his head slightly, watching Kwame. The dim glow of the van's interior light cast shadows across his face, but his eyes, they were sharp, darting from the windows to the door, measuring, calculating. He was planning something. Bakari felt a flicker of something he wasn't ready to name. Hope, trust. It was too soon to trust him again, but right now Kwame was all he had. Kwame shifted beside him, barely perceptible. His fingers twitched, almost unnoticeable, but Bakari saw it. A signal. Bakari exhaled slowly, silently. Kwame was working on his restraints. Bakari swallowed, his throat dry. The van was slowing down. That meant they were either reaching their destination or passing a checkpoint. Either way, their window of opportunity was small. The van hit another pothole, jolting everyone inside. It was the perfect distraction. Kwame struck first, his body coiled like a spring, feet slamming into the scarred man's chest with brutal force. The man barely had time to grunt before he was thrown backward, hitting the van's door with a sickening crack. Bakari moved on instinct. His bound hands curled into fists as he rammed his shoulder into the nearest guard, sending him off balance. "You little—" The driver swerved. The van screeched. The world tilted. Kwame was already a step ahead. His zip ties were gone, snapped somehow, and he lunged forward, wresting a gun from the guard's belt. The barrel swung upward. Another sharp turn. The van slammed to the side. Metal groaned. Tires screeched. And then, impact. The van flipped. Bakari's world became a blur of motion, pain, and the deafening crunch of steel against asphalt. Bakari's ears rang. His body ached. The van lay on its side. One of the doors twisted open. Smoke curled from the hood, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. Bakari blinked, his vision swimming. "Kwame!" He forced himself to move, biting back a groan as he turned his head. Kwame was already pushing himself up, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the same thought passed between them. They had to run. Now. Bakari's muscles screamed in protest as he pushed himself up, stumbling out of the wreckage. The guards were still down, some unconscious, some groaning in pain. Kwame grabbed his arm. "Move!" They ran. Bakari's feet barely felt the ground as they tore through the alleyways, their breath ragged, adrenaline fueling every step. Behind them, the city roared to life, horns blaring, voices shouting. Omar's men wouldn't stay down for long. They darted past a row of closed shops, cutting through an abandoned lot. Kwame was leading, moving like he knew exactly where to go. Bakari wanted to ask, wanted to know what the hell had just happened, but questions could wait. Survival came first, and right now, they were still being hunted. Bakari's lungs burned as he ran, Kwame just a step ahead, his heart pounded against his ribs, each breath a knife to his side. Behind them, the city was waking up to the chaos they had left behind. The sirens growing louder, the distant shouts of men still looking for them. They weren't safe, not even close, they couldn't stay in the city. Kwame took out his phone as they reached an abandoned parking lot. He hesitated for only a second before dialing a number. "Kenji," he said, breathless. "I need your help." A pause, then a gruff voice answered. "Where are you?" Kwame looked at Bakari. "Somewhere I can't stay." Another pause. Then Kenji spoke again. "Meet me at the old train station, now." They had no other choice. The train station was a skeleton of what it once was, abandoned, forgotten, swallowed by time. The sound of distant traffic felt worlds away as they crouched near a rusted platform, waiting. Then, headlights cut through the darkness. A black pickup truck rolled to a stop, its tires crunching against the gravel. Kenji stepped out, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and a past written in the scars across his knuckles. He looked Kwame over, then Bakari. "You look like hell," he muttered. Kwame smirked. "You should see the other guy." Kenji snorted but didn't press for details. Instead, he jerked his head toward the truck. "Get in, I know a place." Bakari exchanged a glance with Kwame before climbing into the passenger seat. Kwame slid in beside him, his body tense. Kenji drove in silence, the city fading behind them as they took winding roads into the countryside. The hum of the engine was the only sound between them. After an hour, the roads turned rougher, the lights of civilization disappearing completely. Trees towered above them, their shadows stretching like dark fingers across the dirt path. Then, at the edge of the forest, a small wooden cabin came into view, nestled deep within the trees. Kenji killed the engine. "Stay here as long as you need," he said, tossing Kwame a set of keys. His tone was casual, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "But be careful." Bakari frowned. "Careful of what?" Kenji didn't answer right away. He just gave a tight smile. "Just don't trust too easily." Then, without another word, he got back in the truck and drove away, leaving them alone in the silence of the woods. Bakari turned to Kwame. "Can we trust him?" Kwame let out a slow breath, staring at the cabin. "We don't have a choice." They stepped inside, locking the door behind them. The cabin was silent except for the rhythmic crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the kind of quiet that made the world feel distant, as if nothing beyond these walls mattered. Kwame locked the door behind them, his muscles still tense, his ears still tuned to the night, listening for threats. But there were none. For once there was no running, no hiding, just the two of them. Bakari leaned against the wooden wall, watching Kwame. "You don't trust Kenji," he stated. Kwame exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I trust him to do what benefits him." Bakari nodded, stepping forward, closing the space between them. His fingers brushed over Kwame's arm, feeling the tension still coiled beneath his skin. "But he helped us." Kwame's gaze softened, just a little. "Yeah." "Then let's take it," Bakari said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's take the peace while we have it." Kwame studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small sigh, he let his shoulders drop. Let himself relax. Just a little. Just enough. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the blankets thick and soft, carrying the scent of fresh pine. Bakari lay on his side, facing Kwame, their bodies inches apart. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting shadows that danced across Kwame's face. For the first time since they met, Kwame looked At ease. Not entirely, but enough. Bakari smiled, reaching out to trace his fingers over Kwame's wrist, where the skin was slightly rough but warm. "So, tell me," he said, voice playful. "What's the dream?" Kwame huffed a quiet laugh. "Dream? You know?" Bakari's fingers ghosted over Kwame's palm. "If none of this was happening, if we weren't running." Kwame's lips parted slightly, as if the question caught him off guard. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought I'd have the chance to dream." Bakari's chest ached at that. He squeezed Kwame's hand. "Well, I think you should start." Kwame's gaze softened, searching Bakari's face. "And what about you?" Bakari smiled. "Somewhere peaceful, a small house, a big bed, no alarms, no guns, just..." His thumb brushed over Kwame's knuckles. "Just this." Kwame's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Slowly, he turned his hand, lacing their fingers together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of something warm, something neither of them had dared to hope for before. Kwame's voice was barely above a whisper. "That sounds nice." Bakari's heart thudded. "Yeah, it does." The minutes stretched into hours. Neither of them slept, but neither of them wanted to. They talked about nothing, about everything. Kwame told Bakari about growing up near the city, about how he never really belonged anywhere, how he always had to fight to survive. Bakari told Kwame about his childhood, about the places he wanted to see, the life he once imagined for himself before everything changed. At some point, Kwame reached out, brushing a hand through Bakari's curls. "You know what I like about you?" he murmured. Bakari smirked. "My charm?" Kwame chuckled. "That. But also, you make me want something more." Bakari's breath hitched. His fingers curled into the fabric of Kwame's shirt. "That's good, right?" Kwame nodded, his eyes dark and warm. "Yeah, it's good." Bakari grinned. "Well, you know what I like about you." Kwame arched a brow. "This should be good." Bakari shifted closer, their noses almost touching. "You act all tough, but deep down, you care more than anyone I've ever met." Kwame swallowed. "That's dangerous." Bakari's voice dropped to a whisper. "So am I." Kwame let out a soft laugh. "Fair point." Bakari wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was Kwame, but suddenly there was no space between them. Kwame's lips met his, soft but insistent, tasting of firelight and something sweet, something Bakari couldn't name. Bakari sighed into the kiss, his fingers tangling in Kwame's hair, pulling him closer. Kwame groaned softly, pressing their bodies together, deepening the kiss. It was slow, unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. For once, they weren't running. For once, they weren't afraid. When they finally pulled back, Kwame rested his forehead against Bakari's, his breathing uneven. "I could get used to this," Kwame murmured. Bakari smirked, brushing his lips over Kwame's jaw. "Then maybe we should make it a habit." Kwame chuckled, shaking his head. "You're impossible. And you love it." Kwame didn't deny it. They curled up together beneath the blankets. Kwame's arm draped over Bakari's waist, Bakari's fingers tracing circles against Kwame's skin. The fire burned low. Outside, the world kept moving. But inside this cabin, inside this moment, nothing else existed but them. For the first time, it wasn't about survival. It was just about them, and that was enough. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, then don't forget to leave a like and to comment your favorite part of the story. Also, make sure you subscribe so that you never miss out on new episodes. Don't forget to share this video for others to enjoy. If you would like to see how the story goes on, then comment part 4 in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.